An 11-year-old girl hides behind her mom's cleaning cart as a billionaire CEO slams a German document on the table. Translate this, and you'll earn my salary for a day, $32,500, he sneered. The room erupts in laughter. To these men, it's a joke. Amelia Vance, the maid, stood silent, gripping the cart handle until her knuckles whitened. Alara's pulse thundered in her ears. That money was more than a year of her mother's wages, more than enough to erase the eviction notice screaming from their fridge. No one knows she can read every word. No one sees the genius carrying her grandfather's fountain pen in her backpack. But this little girl is about to outsmart an empire, expose a fraud, and change her family's future forever. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A promise of a fortune hung in a room where she was meant to be invisible. An 11-year-old girl saw a path to save her mother. But to walk it, she would have to reveal a secret legacy no one would ever believe she carried. The silence in the boardroom was heavy. It felt like the thick, polished air before a thunderstorm. 11-year-old Alara Vance huddled behind her mother's cleaning cart. The cart was her metal island in a vast ocean of mahogany and glass. The men in the room were like sharks, circling the massive table in their dark, expensive suits. They smelled of leather and a sharp, bitter coffee Alara knew cost more than her mother's breakfast. Her mother, Amelia, moved with a quiet grace that made her almost invisible. That was her job. She wiped away smudges and fingerprints. She emptied wastebaskets filled with crumpled papers that held million-dollar ideas. She was a ghost in the machine of corporate power. Alara, today, was her little shadow. There was no school and no money for a sitter, so Alara had come along, with a promise to be as silent as a mouse. The man at the head of the table was Caspian Thorne. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but his presence filled every corner. His voice was like stones grinding together, low and powerful. He held up a thick document, its pages filled with dense, blocky text. "This is from Richter Precision," Thorne announced. His eyes swept over his team of executives. "The deal of a lifetime. They want to partner with us on the new hydrocell engine." A nervous energy filled the room. The executives leaned forward. "The problem," Thorne continued, tossing the document onto the table with a loud thud, "is that it's in German. Old German. Technical German. And they want a response by Friday." He paused, letting the weight of the deadline settle. "Our translation department is stumped. The software is useless. It reads like nonsense." He scanned the faces of his top men, each one a portrait of high-priced education and ambition. Then, a cruel smile played on Caspian Thorne's lips. "So, let's make this interesting." He looked around the room, his gaze a physical weight. "Anyone in this company who can translate this proposal accurately gets my salary for a day." He let the offer hang in the air. Alara peeked around the cart. The men looked at each other, confused. Fletcher Vance, the vice president of operations, laughed nervously. "And what is your daily salary, Caspian?" Thorne's smile widened. $32,500. The number echoed in the vast room. A collective gasp was followed by a wave of laughter. It was a joke, a rich man's game. The amount was absurd, a fantasy figure. To these men, it was a day's pay. To Amelia and Alara, it was a lifeline they couldn't even imagine. It was more than Amelia made in an entire year of backbreaking work. "Perhaps we should call a university," someone suggested. "No time," Thorne snapped. "And this is confidential. It doesn't leave this room." His sharp eyes scanned the space and landed, for a brief, dismissive moment, on the cleaning cart. He nudged it with the toe of his gleaming Italian shoe. "Maybe the maid can give it a try? I'm sure they teach archaic German engineering dialects in housekeeping school." The laughter was louder this time, sharp and dismissive. It washed over Alara and her mother. Amelia's face remained perfectly still, a mask of professional emptiness. But Alara saw her mother's knuckles turn white as she gripped the handle of the cart. Alara felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck. She shrank further behind the cart, wishing she could disappear completely. Her eyes fell to her small, worn backpack at the bottom of the cart. Tucked inside was her most prized possession. It was a heavy fountain pen with a silver nib, nestled beside a worn, leather-bound journal. They were her grandfather's. $32,500. The number kept repeating in her head. It wasn't just money. It was a miracle. It was the exact amount they needed to stop the eviction. It was the money for the security deposit on a new, clean apartment, one without the black mold that made her mother cough at night. It was the cost of dignity. Alara's small hand tightened into a fist. The laughter of the powerful men faded into a dull roar in her ears. She wasn't just a mouse hiding behind a cleaning cart. She was Sergeant Elias Vance's granddaughter. And she understood every single word on that page. The small apartment felt even smaller that night. The single window looked out onto a brick wall. The air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and worry. The eviction notice was stuck to the refrigerator with a weak magnet. The stark red letters seemed to shout at them. Final notice. Vacate in 72 hours. Amelia sat at the tiny kitchen table, her shoulders slumped. She was sorting a small pile of bills, her face etched with a familiar exhaustion. Alara watched her from the doorway of her room. Her mother looked so tired, so fragile. She worked from dusk until dawn, cleaning the messes of men who laughed at her for a living. Yet, she never complained. She always had a soft smile for Alara, a gentle hand to brush the hair from her forehead. "Mama," Alara said softly. Amelia looked up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, sweet pea. You should be sleeping." "I'm not tired." Alara walked over and stood beside her mother. She looked at the pile of bills. "Is it bad?" Amelia sighed, her shoulders slumping a little more. "We'll be okay, honey. We always are." But her voice was thin, like a thread stretched too tight. Alara knew the truth. She heard her mother on the phone with the landlord, her voice pleading. She saw the way her mother sometimes skipped dinner, saying she wasn't hungry, so there would be enough food for Alara's lunch. The weight of their world rested entirely on her mother's tired shoulders. Alara went back to her room. It was little more than a closet with a small bed. On her nightstand sat the leather journal and the silver fountain pen. She picked them up. The leather was soft and worn smooth from decades of use. The pen felt cool and solid in her hand. It was a Lamy 2000, a classic of German design. Her grandfather had told her it was the only pen he ever used. Elias Vance had been a codebreaker for the U.S. Army during the Cold War. He was stationed in Berlin for 15 years. He spoke German so perfectly that many Germans thought he was a native. He hadn't just spoken the language. He understood its soul, its precision, its poetry. He was a legend in certain quiet circles of intelligence, a man who could see patterns where others saw only chaos. He had passed away 2 years ago, but he had left his legacy to Alara. From the time she could talk, he had spoken to her in German. He didn't teach her with flashcards or grammar books. He taught her with stories, with old German folk tales, with poetry by Rilke. He taught her the logic of the language, the way words were built like intricate machines. "Language is the ultimate code, Alara," he would say, his voice a gentle rumble. "Every word has a history. Every sentence has a structure. If you can understand the code, you can understand the world." He had filled the journal with his thoughts, his translations of complex technical manuals, and his own elegant handwriting, in both English and German. For the last 2 years, Alara had spent hours with that journal. It was her connection to him. It was her secret world. She could read his complex notes on radio engineering and cryptography. She understood the technical schematics he drew. It was a language they shared, a secret code between a brilliant old soldier and his quiet granddaughter. She opened the journal now. The faint, dusty smell of old paper and ink filled the small room. She ran her fingers over her grandfather's script. He had taught her that knowledge was not a weapon, but a bridge. "Words build bridges between worlds," he used to say, echoing a phrase his own father had taught him. The words of the men in the boardroom echoed in her mind. Their sharp laughter, their dismissal of her mother. They saw a maid. They saw a poor, inconvenient child. They did not see Amelia's strength. They did not see the legacy that flowed in Alara's veins. A quiet resolve hardened in her chest. It was terrifying. The thought of speaking up in that room of giants made her stomach twist into a knot. They would laugh at her. They would be angry. Her mother could lose her job, the only thing keeping them from being on the street. But the image of her mother's tired face, the red letters of the eviction notice, the memory of her grandfather's proud smile, they were stronger than her fear. He had taught her to be brave. He had taught her that true strength was quiet, not loud. She wouldn't let them be invisible anymore. She wouldn't let them be victims of a rich man's cruel joke. Her grandfather had given her a gift. It was a key, a codebreaker's tool. And for the first time in her life, she knew she had to use it. Not just for the money, but for her mother. For the honor of her grandfather's name. She would build a bridge. Or she would burn their world down trying. The next day, Alara's heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It felt like a trapped bird. She accompanied her mother to the Thorn Enterprises tower, her backpack feeling heavier than usual. Her plan was simple, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was a single, small stone aimed at a giant. Her mother worked her usual afternoon shift, cleaning the executive suites. The offices were mostly empty as the executives were in late meetings. Alara stayed on her best behavior, reading a book in a small break room. But she wasn't reading. She was listening. She was waiting. Finally, near the end of the shift, Amelia had to clean the main boardroom. It was empty. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the room. The German proposal still lay on the table, an object of frustration and immense value. A few pages were scattered around it, covered in handwritten notes and frustrated scribbles. "I'll be quick, sweet pea," Amelia whispered, starting to gather the trash. "Mama, can I look at the big windows for a minute?" Alara asked, her voice small. Amelia hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but don't touch anything on the table. It's very important." "I won't," Alara promised. As her mother moved to the far side of the room, Alara approached the great mahogany table. Her legs felt shaky. The document was right there. She could see the title page. She recognized the font. It was Fraktur, an old style her grandfather had taught her to read. The executive's notes were a mess. They had used an online translator, and the results were comical. They had translated high-precision tolerance as high-praise tolerance. They had mistaken dynamic fluid cooling for energetic liquid politeness. They were completely lost. Her hands trembled as she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notepad and a simple pencil. She couldn't use her grandfather's pen. It was too precious, too identifiable. She found a critical section on the third page. It described the proprietary alloy used in the engine's core. The translation software had rendered it as a jumble of nonsensical words. Alara knew exactly what it meant. Her grandfather had worked with similar metallurgical patents. Quickly, on her little notepad, she wrote a clear, concise translation of the single, most critical paragraph. She didn't just translate the words. She translated the intent, the engineering context. Paragraph 3.2 refers to a cobalt-tungsten carbide composite, hardened via cryogenic tempering. The key phrase does not mean unchanging fence structure. It refers to a stable molecular lattice that prevents microfractures under high thermal stress. She tore the small sheet from the pad. Her heart was pounding. She looked over at her mother, whose back was still turned. With a shaking hand, Alara slipped the piece of paper under the cover of the main document. It was a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of ignorance. She didn't sign it. She left no trace. It was an anonymous whisper of truth in a room full of loud, confident error. She scurried back to the window just as her mother finished. "Ready to go?" Amelia asked, her voice soft. Alara nodded, unable to speak. She felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. The stone had been thrown. Now, all she could do was wait and see if the giant would even notice. The next morning, Alara felt a knot of anxiety so tight she could barely eat her toast. She imagined a dozen terrible scenarios. A security guard finding her note and throwing it away. An angry Caspian Thorn realizing someone had touched his precious document and firing her mother on the spot. But what actually happened was something she hadn't anticipated. From her listening post in the break room, she heard raised voices from down the hall. It was Caspian Thorn's unmistakable baritone, but it wasn't angry. It was intrigued. "Who wrote this?" she heard him demand. Alara's blood ran cold. She crept to the door and peeked through the small window. The executive team was gathered in the hallway outside the boardroom. Thorn was holding her small piece of notepaper. Fletcher Vance, the VP, looked pale. "I have no idea. It was just there. This morning." "Stable molecular lattice," Thorn read from the note, a look of dawning understanding on his face. "That makes sense. That's why the performance specs are so high." He looked at his team, his eyes blazing with a new fire. "This isn't just a translation. This is someone who understands the engineering." "Who is it?" Who on our team has this kind of technical German? The executives looked at each other, bewildered. No one spoke. Then, Fletcher Vance did something that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, a strange, calculating look in his eyes. Actually, Caspian, he said, his voice smooth as oil. I'd forgotten to mention. I did a semester abroad in Munich during college. Focused on technical sciences. Thorne stared at him. You did? Yes, Fletcher lied, his confidence growing with every word. I saw the mess the team was making of the translation last night and stayed late. I worked on that section myself. I must have left my notes there by mistake. Alara's jaw dropped. He was taking credit. He was stealing her words. Thorne clapped Fletcher on the shoulder, a rare smile appearing on his face. Vance, I had no idea. You've been hiding your light under a bushel. He waved Alara's note in the air. This is the breakthrough we needed. Take point on this. I want you to lead the translation effort. Forget the committee. This is your project now. Of course, Caspian, Fletcher said, puffing out his chest. I won't let you down. As the group dispersed, their moods lifted, Alara slipped back from the door. A cold, bitter anger replaced her fear. It wasn't fair. That man, with his expensive suit and smug smile, had just stolen from her. He had taken her grandfather's knowledge and passed it off as his own. The small victory she had felt was gone, replaced by the stinging injustice. But beneath the anger, a new feeling began to bubble up. Determination. Fletcher Vance thought he had won. He thought he could coast on her one small paragraph. But the document was over 50 pages long. He had no idea what was in the rest of it. He had stolen a single key, but she held the entire ring. That night, she laid the plan out for her second move. This time, it wouldn't be a whisper. It would be a roar. For 2 days, a strange calm settled over Thorne Enterprises. A false calm. From her quiet vantage points, Alara watched Fletcher Vance. He had locked himself in a small, glass-walled office. The German document spread out before him like a map to a land he had never visited. He looked important. He exuded an air of stressed authority, taking calls, pointing at charts, and scribbling notes with a frantic energy. But Alara saw the truth. He was a man drowning in silence. She saw him typing phrases into online translators, his brow furrowed in confusion at the garbled results. She saw him flipping through a German-English dictionary so new its spine cracked when he opened it. He was a fraud, playing a part, and the curtain was set to rise at any moment. Caspian Thorne was not a patient man. The deadline from Richter Precision was Friday. It was now Wednesday. The pressure was mounting. Alara could feel it in the hurried footsteps of the executives, in the tense, hushed conversations she overheard while emptying wastebaskets. The $32,500 felt further away than ever. The eviction notice on their fridge felt closer. They had less than 24 hours now. Her mother had started packing a few boxes, a quiet, heartbreaking admission of defeat. She packed photos, a chipped teacup that had belonged to her grandmother, and Alara's favorite books. Each item placed in the box felt like a shovelful of dirt on a grave. Alara knew she couldn't just leave another anonymous note. Fletcher Vance would simply steal it again. She needed a way to expose him, to show Thorne who the real translator was, without ever saying a word herself. The plan that formed in her mind was more daring than the first. It was a trap, baited with the one thing Fletcher Vance couldn't resist, the appearance of an easy solution. Her grandfather had taught her about more than just language. He had taught her about systems. Every machine, every code, every corporation, he'd said, has a weakness. A single point of failure. You just have to find the right lever. Fletcher Vance's weakness was his arrogance. Alara's lever would be her knowledge. Late Wednesday afternoon, her mother was assigned to clean the executive washrooms, a task that took her away from the office floor for a precious 15 minutes. It was all the time Alara needed. She approached the glass-walled office where Fletcher was working. He wasn't there. He had been called into a meeting with Thorne, a fact Alara had confirmed by listening to his secretary's phone call. His desk was a mess of papers. The German proposal was open to a section detailing the engine's cooling system, a complex network of microchannels and thermal regulators. Alara took a deep breath. She pulled a pen from her pocket, not her grandfather's, but a cheap ballpoint. On a company memo pad, she began to write. This time, she didn't provide a perfect translation. She provided a flawed one. A dangerously, seductively flawed one. She translated a key technical specification, which meant coolant flow rate, as coolant dry run protection. They were related concepts, close enough to seem plausible to a layman, but fundamentally different in engineering terms. One was about volume, the other was a safety feature. To make it even more convincing, she included a complex but incorrect mathematical formula to calculate the supposed dry run threshold, a formula that looked impressive but would produce a disastrously wrong number. She also added a second, more subtle error. The proposal mentioned a specific German industrial standard, DIN 8580. It was a classification for manufacturing processes. Alera's note helpfully identified it as DIN 8850, a standard for office furniture ergonomics. It was a tiny, almost unnoticeable mistake, but one that any German engineer would spot in a heartbeat. It was a fingerprint, a sign of amateurism disguised as expertise. She folded the note and wrote, "Mr. Vance, found this in the translation department's files. Thought it might help. A friend on the outside." She slipped it onto his chair, where he couldn't miss it. Then she vanished, back to the safety of her mother's cleaning cart, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had set the trap. Now she had to wait for the mouse to take the cheese. The rest of the day was agony. Every time she heard footsteps, she flinched. Every time a phone rang, she expected it to be security. Her mother noticed her pallor. "Are you feeling okay, sweet pea?" Amelia asked, placing a cool hand on Alera's forehead. "You're not getting sick, are you?" "I'm fine, Mama," Alera mumbled, trying to smile. But the lie felt heavy in her mouth. She was risking everything, her mother's job, their home, their future, all on a gamble that a proud, foolish man would act exactly as she predicted. The next morning, Thursday, was D-Day. The eviction was scheduled for 5 p.m. The Richter proposal was due to be sent back by the end of the day. The air in the tower crackled with tension. Alera saw Fletcher Vance strutting down the hallway. He was holding her booby-trapped note. He had a smug, confident look on his face. He had taken the bait. He had spent the previous evening incorporating her flawed translations into his official response. At 10 a.m., Caspian Thorne called an emergency meeting in the boardroom. Alera and her mother were cleaning the adjacent office, the door conveniently propped open. They were meant to be invisible, and today, Alera used that invisibility as a shield. "All right, Fletcher," Thorne's voice boomed from the boardroom. "Walk us through it. What have you got?" Alera held her breath. "It was a tough nut to crack, Caspian, but I think I've got it," Fletcher began, his voice oozing false confidence. "The real genius of this engine isn't the fuel cell itself. It's the cooling system. They're using a revolutionary dry run protection protocol." Alera could hear the rustle of papers as the other executives followed along. Instead of focusing on the rate of coolant flow, Fletcher continued, quoting her fake note almost verbatim. "They've designed it to automatically shut down if the system runs dry. The thresholds are calculated using this formula." He read out the nonsensical equation. Alera closed her eyes. It was happening. There was a moment of silence. It was broken by a man Alera hadn't noticed before. He was an older gentleman, with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, who had been sitting at the far end of the table. He was Klaus Richter, the head engineer from the German company, who had flown in that morning to oversee the final stages of the deal. He had been silent until now. He cleared his throat softly. When he spoke, it was in perfect, unaccented English, but with a slight German cadence. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm afraid that is incorrect." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Fletcher Vance laughed nervously. "I'm sorry. I'm quite sure that's what the document says." "The document," Mr. Richter said, tapping a page with his finger, refers to the flow rate. "It is the most critical parameter in the entire design. Your formula would cause the engine to overheat and seize within 3 minutes of activation." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It would be catastrophic." Fletcher's face went white. Alera could see him from her hiding spot. All the color drained from his cheeks. "And another small point," Mr. Richter continued, his voice still calm and measured. "You have referenced DIN 8850. This is a standard for the lumbar support in office chairs. I believe you meant DIN 8580, which pertains to metal forming." He looked directly at Fletcher, his kind eyes now as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "These are not mistakes a translator would make, Mr. Vance. This is guesswork." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the silence of a public execution. Caspian Thorne's face was a thundercloud. He stared at Fletcher, his eyes like chips of ice. The smug confidence had melted off Fletcher's face, replaced by a raw, naked panic. He stammered, tried to speak, but no words came out. He was exposed, utterly and completely. Thorne's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. "Fletcher, get out." Fletcher didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled out of his chair, gathering his papers with trembling hands, his face a mask of humiliation. He fled the room, not even glancing at the other executives, who pointedly looked away. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a void of shocked silence. Caspian Thorne stood up and walked to the window, his back to the room. He looked out over the city for a long moment. Alara could feel the fury radiating from him. The deal of a lifetime was slipping through his fingers, all because of the incompetence and deceit of his own vice president. "We're ruined," someone whispered. Thorne turned back to the room. His face was grim. "No, not yet." His eyes swept the room, landing on Klaus Richter. "Klaus, my sincerest apologies. It appears I have been misled." He then looked at his remaining team. "We have until 5 o'clock. We have a German proposal that no one can read, and our potential partner is sitting at this table, watching us implode." He slammed his hand down on the table, making everyone jump. "Does anyone have a solution? Anything?" His gaze swept the room again, filled with desperation and anger. He looked past the expensive suits, the polished shoes, the fearful faces of his leadership team. His eyes moved past the boundaries of the executive world, out into the hallway, into the space occupied by the invisible people. His gaze fell on the cleaning cart, on Amelia, and then on the small, blonde girl half hidden behind it. The little girl who was always there. The little girl who was always silent, always watching. A flicker of something, a memory, an intuition, a wild, desperate guess, crossed his face. He remembered the first note, the elegant, precise translation that had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't Vance. It couldn't have been. So who? He looked straight at Alara. The full force of his attention, the focus of a corporate titan, landed on an 11-year-old girl in a faded t-shirt. "You," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. The girl. "Come here." Amelia froze, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Sir, I am so sorry. She was just—" "It's all right," Thorne said, his eyes never leaving Alara. "I want to talk to her." Alara's legs felt like they were made of stone. This was it, the moment she had both dreaded and hoped for. Slowly, she stepped out from behind the cart. She walked into the boardroom, into the ocean of mahogany and glass. The sharks turned to stare at her. She felt like a minnow in a tank of predators. She stopped at the edge of the great table, her small hands clasped behind her back to keep them from shaking. She looked up at Caspian Thorne. She did not look at the floor. She did not look away. She met his gaze directly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with a strange curiosity. "Alara, sir." "Alara," he repeated. He picked up the proposal. "Have you seen this document before?" Her mother let out a small, choked gasp. This was the moment she could be fired. Alara knew it, but there was no turning back. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Did you write the note for Mr. Vance?" he asked, holding up her second, sabotage translation. "Yes, sir." A murmur went through the room. Klaus Richter leaned forward, his expression one of pure astonishment. Thorne slid the document across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of her. "Prove it," he said. The challenge hung in the air. The fate of a multi-billion-dollar deal, the fate of her family, the weight of her grandfather's legacy. It all came down to this single moment. Alara looked down at the page. It was a section on the engine's power output and efficiency metrics. Dense, technical, and precise. She took a breath, summoning her grandfather's voice, his calm confidence, his love for the beautiful logic of the German language. Then, she began to speak. Section 5.4. Alara began, her voice small but clear in the cavernous room. Peak operational torque is achieved at 12,000 RPM, contingent upon the thermal dissipation rate remaining below 0.8 kilowatts per square meter. She didn't look at the paper. She didn't need to. She had read documents like this in her grandfather's journal 100 times. The words, the concepts, were as familiar to her as a nursery rhyme. The proposal specifies a primary coolant of deionized water with a glycol additive, but it notes, she continued, pointing a small finger at a specific sentence, that this is only for temperate climates. For Arctic or high-altitude operations, they recommend a polyalphalofin-based fluid, which is detailed in Appendix B. She looked up at Klaus Richter. The term they use here is not just about wear resistance. It implies a specific resistance to molecular shearing under extreme pressure, which the online translators would miss. It's the difference between a material that is simply hard and a material that is resilient. Klaus Richter stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at Caspian Thorn, then back at Alara, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. He began to speak in rapid, technical German, firing a complex question at her about harmonic resonance and blade-tip turbulence. Without hesitating, Alara answered him in fluent German. The words flowed from her effortlessly, a perfect, logical stream of engineering terminology and nuanced grammar. She wasn't just a child reciting memorized lines. She was conversing, debating a technical point with a world-class engineer. The rest of the executives sat in stunned silence. They were watching a unicorn paint a masterpiece. Amelia, her mother, leaned against the doorframe, tears streaming down her face. She was watching her daughter, her quiet, little girl, command a room full of the most powerful men in the city. She wasn't just Alara anymore. She was a force, a legacy. After a few minutes, Klaus Richter held up a hand, still smiling. He switched back to English. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice filled with awe. This is remarkable. She is not just translating. She understands. Her comprehension of the underlying principles is better than some of my own junior engineers." He looked at Alara with profound respect. "Young lady, where did you learn to do this?" Alara's gaze flickered for a moment toward her mother, then settled back on Mr. Richter. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. "He was a codebreaker. Sergeant Elias Vance." A ripple of recognition went through the room. The name Vance was not unknown in certain circles, but no one had ever connected the quiet cleaning woman to that legacy. They had seen a maid, not a war hero's daughter. They had seen a child, not his brilliant heir. Caspian Thorne's expression was unreadable. He had been outmaneuvered, his pride wounded by his own VP, his company saved by the daughter of his cleaning lady. He walked slowly around the table until he was standing directly in front of Alara. He was a tall man, and he loomed over her. For a terrifying second, Alara thought he was angry. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face. Then, he did something no one expected. He smiled. It wasn't his cruel, mocking smile from before. It was a genuine, tired, and deeply impressed smile. "Sergeant Elias Vance," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Of course." He turned to his CFO. "Mr. Peterson, arrange a wire transfer." The CFO blinked. "Sir, my salary for a day," Thorne said, his voice ringing with authority. $32,500. Transfer it to? He looked at Amelia. "Amelia Vance, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Transfer it to Amelia Vance," Thorne commanded. Immediately, he then looked back at Alara. "And add a signing bonus. Let's say double that amount." The CFO's jaw dropped. $97,500. A life-changing sum of money, decided in an instant. "Alara," Thorne said, his voice now gentle, "I would like to hire you. As a consultant, your mother will be your legal guardian on the contract. We need this entire document translated and a full technical brief prepared by tomorrow morning." He paused. "Is that something you can do?" Alara looked at her mother. Amelia nodded slowly, her eyes shining with tears of pride and relief. The eviction notice, the late bills, the constant worry, it was all dissolving like a bad dream. Alara stood up a little straighter. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice filled with a newfound confidence. "I can do that." The rest of the day was a blur. A proper office was set up for Alara and her mother, complete with computers, food, and anything else they needed. The executives who had laughed at them now went out of their way to be helpful, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and awe. Amelia sat in a comfortable chair, watching her daughter work, the reality of what was happening slowly sinking in. She had always known Alara was smart, but she had never understood the depth of the gift her father had given her child. Alara worked with a focus that was startling in one so young. She dictated, and a secretary typed. She drew diagrams on a whiteboard. She answered questions from Thorne's top engineers, her explanations clear and concise. She was a natural leader, a natural communicator. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. By sunset, the eviction notice was a forgotten relic. Their old life was over. They had not just survived, they had triumphed. As Alara worked, the heavy silver fountain pen, her grandfather's Lamy 2000, was on the desk beside her. She didn't use it, but its presence gave her strength. It was a silent testament to the man who had built the bridge she was now crossing. Late that night, as the final pages of the translated brief were being printed, Caspian Thorne came into the office. He looked tired but energized. He was holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. He handed one to Alara. "You've saved my company today, Alara," he said, sitting down across from her. "I won't forget it." "You paid us," Alara said simply. "Money is easy." Thorne replied, looking into his cup. "Trust is hard. I trusted the wrong person. A man with a fancy degree and an expensive suit. I never even saw you. Or your mother." He looked up, his eyes filled with a genuine regret. "That was my mistake. A mistake that almost cost me everything." He leaned forward. "This is about more than just this one deal. I'm creating a new position at this company. Director of Special Projects. It's a division for people who can solve impossible problems. People who see things differently." He took a sip of his hot chocolate. "The job comes with a full scholarship to any university in the world, a housing stipend, and a salary that will ensure your mother never has to push a cleaning cart again." He looked at her, his expression serious. "The job is yours, Alara. If you want it. When you're ready for it." Alara was speechless. It was a fairy tale, a dream from which she was afraid she would wake up. She looked at her mother, who was watching them from across the room, her face a beacon of pure, unadulterated joy. Alara turned back to the millionaire. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this?" Caspian Thorne leaned back in his chair and looked out the window at the glittering city lights. "Because my grandfather was a janitor," he said softly. "He was the smartest man I ever knew. He could fix anything, build anything, understand anything. But no one ever gave him a chance because he had calluses on his hands and wore a blue collar. I built this company on the lessons he taught me. And somewhere along the way, I forgot the most important one." He turned his gaze back to Alara, and his eyes held the weight of a long overdue lesson. "Talent doesn't care about job titles," he said. "And genius can be found anywhere. Today, you reminded me of that. The twist wasn't that a little girl could translate a complex document. The twist was that the millionaire, the shark, the man at the top of the food chain, had a heart that could still be taught to see." Years later, Alara Vance walked into the Thorne Enterprises boardroom not as a shadow, but as its youngest ever director. She was no longer a little girl, but a confident young woman who had just graduated from MIT at the age of 18. Her mother, Amelia, was with her, not as a cleaner, but as a guest of honor, there to watch her daughter present a new hydrocell engine design, one Alara had developed herself. The old mahogany table was still there, but the men around it were different. Caspian Thorne, now grayer and kinder, sat at the head, smiling proudly. The culture of the company had changed. They now had scholarship programs for the children of their service staff. They ran coding camps in underserved neighborhoods. They actively looked for talent in unexpected places. Alara placed her notes on the table. Beside them, she placed her grandfather's silver fountain pen. It was no longer a secret treasure, but a symbol of her journey. She looked at the faces in the room, faces of people who saw her, who respected her, who listened to her. She thought of the silence, the laughter, the shame of that day years ago. It felt like another lifetime. Her grandfather had taught her that words build bridges, but she had learned that sometimes you have to tear down a wall first. And the best tool for that was not anger or force, but the undeniable power of a truth that everyone has chosen to ignore. She took a deep breath, clicked on the first slide of her presentation, and began to speak, her voice clear and strong, the voice of the future. The transition from a life of scarcity to one of security was not instantaneous. It was a series of small, breathtaking moments that, when stitched together, formed the fabric of a new reality. The first was the quiet hum of the bank's wire transfer machine, a sound that officially erased the eviction notice from their lives. The second was walking out of the Thorn Enterprises tower that evening, not through the service exit, but through the grand, marble-floored lobby. No one tried to stop them. The security guard, a man who had never once met her mother's eyes, tipped his hat to Amelia. "Have a good evening, Mrs. Vance," he said. The simple act of acknowledgement, of being seen, was so overwhelming that Amelia had to stop and lean against a pillar to catch her breath. They didn't move into a fancy penthouse. Amelia, practical and grounded, found a modest two-bedroom apartment in a safe, clean building with good schools and a small park nearby. For the first time in Alara's life, she had her own room, a space that was more than just a converted closet. It had a large window that let in the morning sun. The day they moved in, they didn't own much furniture, so they had a picnic on the living room floor. They ate pizza out of a box and drank soda from the bottle, and they laughed until their sides hurt. The specter of poverty, the constant, grinding worry that had been their third roommate for so long, was gone. The silence it left behind was filled with peace. Alara's consultancy with Thorn Enterprises became a more permanent arrangement. Caspian Thorn was true to his word. A trust was established for Alara, managed by a team of lawyers and financial advisors, ensuring her education and future were secure. Amelia's new position as program director for the Vance Initiative was, for her, a far greater challenge than it was for her daughter. Her first day, she walked into an office with her name on the door. It was a beautiful office with a view of the city. For the first hour, she just stood there, touching the smooth surface of the desk, running her hand over the plush fabric of the visitor's chair. It felt like a costume, a role she was unqualified to play. A week later, she was scheduled to interview the first candidate for the new scholarship, a 17-year-old boy named Leo, the son of one of the company's warehouse foremen. She had a list of corporate-approved questions in front of her, full of words like synergy and paradigm. She felt like a fraud. Leo came in, a tall, gangly kid with calloused hands and paint stains on his jeans. He was nervous, his eyes darting around the room. He clutched a worn portfolio to his chest. Amelia looked at his terrified face and saw herself. She saw the years of feeling out of place, of believing that rooms like this weren't meant for people like them. She pushed the official questionnaire aside. "Leo," she said softly, her voice the same one she used to comfort Alara after a bad dream. "My name is Amelia. For 20 years, I cleaned rooms just like this one. So let's forget all this." She gestured around the fancy office. "Tell me what you love to do." The boy's shoulders relaxed. Hesitantly, he opened his portfolio. It was filled with breathtaking designs for furniture. Each piece was elegant, functional, and beautiful, sketched out on scrap paper and the backs of packing slips. He explained that he'd built a few of the pieces himself, using discarded pallets from the warehouse. Amelia didn't see a nervous teenager. She saw an artist, a designer, a mind brimming with untapped potential. She spent an hour talking to him, not about his grades or his test scores, but about his dreams. She understood, in a way no executive ever could, the quiet ambition that grows in the shadows of society. Leo became the first Vance Initiative scholar. He went on to study industrial design and, years later, would become one of the most celebrated furniture designers in the country. Amelia had not just given him a scholarship. She had given him permission to believe in himself. She had found her calling, not as a ghost in the machine, but as its heart. Alara's new life was not without its own challenges. She was still a child, a brilliant one, but a child. Thorne arranged for her to be privately tutored, to be fast-tracked through an advanced curriculum. But this set her apart. At 15, she took a summer course in advanced calculus at the local university, hoping to feel like a normal student. The other students, all older, stared at her. They whispered. When she tried to join a study group, the leader, a cocky young man, scoffed. "What are you going to contribute, kid? Doodles of ponies?" He laughed. Alara quietly solved a problem on the board that the entire group had been stuck on for an hour, then packed her bag and left. The isolation was a heavy price to pay for her gift. Her truest friends remained the most unlikely. Klaus Richter, the German engineer, became a long-distance mentor, a grandfatherly figure who celebrated her intellect. Caspian Thorne also stepped in. He recognized her loneliness, perhaps seeing a reflection of his own singular, obsessive path to success. One afternoon, he took her to a dusty, forgotten warehouse owned by the company. Inside were prototypes of failed inventions, monuments to ideas that had been ahead of their time. He showed her a strange, clunky device from the 1970s. "My grandfather built this," Thorne said, running a hand over the dusty metal. "It's a device to capture moisture from the air and turn it into clean drinking water. He designed it for farming communities during a drought. He took it to a big bank to get a loan. The bankers laughed at him. A janitor wanting to solve the world's water crisis? They told him to stick to his mops." Thorne's voice was quiet. 20 years later, a Silicon Valley company made billions off the same idea. My grandfather was never bitter. He just said, "Some people can only see what's right in front of them. It's not their fault. I built my empire to prove those bankers wrong. But I became just like them. I only saw the suit, the title, the resume. I forgot to look for the person with grease under their fingernails and a world-changing idea in their head." It was during this time that Alara made a discovery that would define her purpose. She was studying her grandfather's journal and noticed a strange pattern in his entries from 1968. They looked like notes on radio frequencies, but the numbers didn't align with any known broadcasting standards. She realized it wasn't a frequency. It was a cipher. Using the code-breaking skills he had taught her, she spent a week unraveling it. The translated text was a revelation. It was her grandfather's secret diary, detailing his work with a small, underground network. He had used his technical skills to forge travel documents and create new identities for East German scientists and their families, helping them escape to the West. He wrote of late-night handoffs at Checkpoint Charlie, of coded messages hidden in weather reports, of the immense risk and the profound moral duty he felt. One entry was particularly moving. He described helping a young physicist and his family escape. The man's daughter, a little girl named Anya, had given him a small, hand-carved wooden bird as a thank you. "To hold a life's freedom in your hands," her grandfather wrote, "is a heavier weight than any weapon." This discovery gave Alara's own journey a new sense of purpose. Her gift wasn't just for engines and alloys. It was about building bridges for people. The Vance Initiative became her true passion. She was fighting for the other Alaras, and the Leos, and the Anyas of the world. The day she turned 18, she formally accepted the position of Director of Special Projects. Her first official act was to fly to Germany to finalize a new joint venture, a project based on a concept she had developed from one of her grandfather's old schematics, a highly efficient, low-cost water purification system. As she stood in the Thorne Enterprises boardroom, ready to present her vision, the room felt different. The mahogany table was the same, but the atmosphere had been transformed. The fear and arrogance had been replaced by a spirit of collaboration. Her mother sat in the front row, not as a silent observer, but as a proud and essential member of the team. Caspian Thorne sat at the head of the table, not as an intimidating monarch, but as a proud mentor. Alara opened her briefcase and took out her notes. Beside them, she placed the worn leather journal and the silver fountain pen. They were her inheritance. She looked at the faces around the table, a diverse group that included Leo, the warehouse foreman's son, now a rising star in the company's design department. She thought about that day, 7 years ago, the laughter that had felt like stones. She had walked into that room as a ghost. Today, she stood before them as their leader. The moral of the story was not simply that a little girl had been underestimated. It was that an entire system had been built on that foundation of underestimation. A system that had been blind to the genius polishing its tables and deaf to the wisdom emptying its trash. Her grandfather had broken enemy codes, but Alara had broken a more important one, the code of social prejudice. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and confident. "My grandfather, Sergeant Elias Vance, believed that the most complex problems have the most elegant solutions. He also believed that the best ideas often come from the people we forget to ask." She clicked to her first slide, revealing not a complex diagram, but a simple photograph of her mother's old cleaning cart. "This," she said, "was the first office of the Special Projects Division. It taught us that our greatest assets are not always in our executive suites. They are in our hallways and warehouses. 7 years ago, we founded the Vance Initiative to find those assets. Some called it charity. They were wrong. It was an investment." She clicked to the next slide. It showed a picture of Leo's award-winning chair design. Leo's designs have generated $17 million in revenue in 2 years. Our initial investment in him was a $50,000 scholarship. That is a return of 34,000%. I challenge any of you to find a better ROI. She continued, her voice filled with passion, laying out a vision that was both compassionate and fiercely profitable. It was a new corporate philosophy, built on the simple, radical idea that every human being has value. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by a thunderous round of applause. Later that day, after the contracts were signed, Alara stood with her mother by the great boardroom window, looking out over the city. "He would be so proud of you, sweet pea," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. "He'd be proud of you, too, Mama," Alara replied, taking her mother's hand. On the table behind them lay the first major directive of her new division, the official launch of the water purification project that would bring clean water to thousands. It was waiting for her signature. Alara walked to the table, uncapped her grandfather's Lamy 2000 fountain pen, and for the very first time, signed her own name. The silver nib moved smoothly across the paper, a bridge between the past and the future, a testament to a legacy not of war and codes, but of quiet courage and the simple, profound act of seeing the person right in front of you. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive